से डराता है उसे तू बेकार, हो चुका है जो नसीबे सहरी से 100 बार। नहीं तेरा नशेमन कसरे सुल्तानी के गुंबद पर, तू शाही है बसेरा कर पहाड़ों की चट्टानों में। खुदा तुझे किसी तूफान से आशना कर दे कि तेरे बहर की मौजों में इज़्तिराब नहीं। तुझे किताब से मुमकिन नहीं फराग कि तू किताब ख्वाह है साहिबे किताब में। खुदी को कर बुलंद इतना कि हर तकदीर से पहले खुदा बंदे से खुद पूछे, बता तेरी रजा क्या है। दयार इश्क में अपना मकाम पैदा कर, नया जमाना नए सुबह शाम पैदा कर। खुदा अगर दिल फितरत शनास दे तुझको, सकूत लाला गुल से कलाम पैदा कर। मेरा तरीक अमीरी नहीं फकीरी है, खुदी ना बेच गरीबी में नाम पैदा कर। मुखालिफ से ना घबरा ऐ उकाब, ये तो चलती है तुझे ऊंचा उड़ाने के लिए।
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. There are many people joining this from near and far, but we welcome you all from Shahe Najaf, Washington, D.C. We are gathered here to celebrate Allama Iqbal, who turned 143 years a few days ago on November the 9th. He was born on November the 9th, 1877. Allama Iqbal, for those who do not know, was the poet-philosopher who first articulated the idea of Pakistan, an entire country. And although he did not live to see the realization of that idea, it was his words, and especially his poetry, which powered the Muslims of the subcontinent to assert their right and to gain their own homeland. What some people do not understand, though, is that Iqbal was not just an inspiration for those Muslims who became Pakistanis later on. Iqbal was an inspiration for the entire subcontinent. In fact, some of his most famous poetry is translated by Sikhs and Hindus. For example, his famous Shikwa Jawab-e Shikwa, where he presents a Muslim's complaint to God, and then God's response. We will cover this poem in this program too. That was translated and presented by the famous Sikh writer Khushwant Singh, who also elaborated Iqbal's concept of khudi, or self-realization. Iqbal was also an inspiration for the people of Iran, and Dr. Ali Shariati and others used his ideas to actually mount a resistance movement against the monarchy, which eventually led to the change in the monarchy towards the new regime. So Iqbal has been an inspiration not just for Pakistanis, but for a very broad community of Muslims, non-Muslims, and people interested in philosophy and his ideas. Just to clarify that this is the first in a series of events that have been organized, or that are being organized, to celebrate the very rich um, Indo-Persian poetic tradition that exists. Um, although prose and poetry have featured in all languages of the world, old and new, the power of verse or shairi in the Urdu language, and perhaps also Persian, is unique. Indeed, it would not be an exaggeration to say that the Urdu language, as it is found today, found its maturity and its zenith in the 18th and 19th centuries in those congregations where poetry was recited, either in mushairas or in maqasidas, where eulogy of the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam was recited, or in marthiyas, which narrated the tragedy of Karbala. All of these renditions of poetry gave Urdu its full range of vocabulary, its idiom, and really the tenor of the language which has reached us today. So all the founders, the famous names in Urdu poetry, certainly Mir Taqi Mir, Mir Anis, Mirza Ghalib, Mirza Dabir, and even up to today, the famous names Faiz Ahmed Faiz, Josh Mili Abadi, Allama Iqbal included, are all poets. And I think if many Pakistanis were asked to name big names in Urdu, in the Urdu language, from the earlier times, they may struggle to actually name somebody who made a big contribution to prose, but they will remember and they will be familiar with these names of the great Urdu poets. Now, I have tried to reflect on why this is the case, why verse and poetry and sher has had such a profound impact in the Urdu language and its relationship with the people. And one plausible explanation is that the meter, the zameen, the wazn of Urdu poetry is quite demanding, and for Persian poetry. And it is quite rhythmic, very powerful. So it has a resonating effect on the listener, and it then becomes easier to memorize those verses, or actually becomes difficult to forget them once those beats, that very sharp meter has registered itself or made imprints on your mind. Let me give you an example of from Iqbal himself. His famous verses, "Kabhi ay haqiqat muntazar nazara libas majaz mein कि हजारों सजदे तड़प रहे हैं मेरी जबीन नियाज में जो मैं सर बसिजदा हुआ कभी तो जमीन से आने लगी सदा तेरा दिल तो है सनम आशना तुझे क्या मिलेगा नमाज में." So just the rhythmic effect of these verses was very powerful. In these two couplets, Iqbal is basically appealing to God that, "Oh God, oh hidden reality, manifest yourself in some material way, for there are 1,000 prostrations yearning in my forehead." And then later on in the poem, Iqbal says that he describes the reality of those prostrations. That when I do actually prostrate, when I did actually prostrate on the ground spoke to me and said, "What benefit will you get from these prostrations when your heart is infatuated with idols?" So this is just one example. Another one, when Iqbal is talking about Ibrahim and his successor in Imam Hussain, "Sidke Khalil bhi hai ishq, sabre Hussain bhi hai ishq, aur ma'rikae wujud mein badro Hunain bhi hai ishq." And here again, Iqbal is trying to connect the love of Abraham and the perseverance of Hussein, and then the battles of Badr and Hunain, where Imam Hussein's father Ali ibn Abi Talib was a key player, as examples of that passionate love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which actually forces us and encourages us to act in a way to better society and this world. And then again, on another occasion, when Iqbal addresses the young Muslim, "Kabhi hai naujawan Muslim, tadabbur bhi kiya tune, wo kya gardun tha, tu jiska hai ek toota hua tara, tujhe us qaum ne pala hai, agoshe mohabbat mein, kuchal dala tha jisne paon mein, taje sare dara." And here Iqbal is saying that, "Oh young Muslim, Do you know which tradition, which inheritance you are part of? And you were raised by a nation whose spiritual strength was such that big empires fell in the wake of that movement. It is not just the material, the military aspect that Iqbal is emphasizing here, but actually the power of the message of Tawheed, which really overpowered the hearts, convinced minds, and enabled Islam to spread in places where polytheism had roots for very long. So these are just some examples of that power of Urdu verse and poetry, and the rhythmic nature of that poetry. And Iqbal was well aware of this power and influence, which is why he used it to propagate his message. He said famously that I am not a poet and I'm not interested in poetry per se, but I've only used poetry as a medium, as a vehicle to convey my message. And his message, which was both a political message for the Muslims of the subcontinent, but also a broader social message to remove injustices and inequality in society, but very importantly, a spiritual message too, to connect man with God, to understand through a self-realization the importance of our connection with God. And then these messages he used to encourage Muslims to rid the yoke of colonialism, rid themselves from this life of subservience and inferiority complex under the British Raj. A personal example of Iqbal's use of poetry to convey his message is when his son Javed Iqbal wrote him a letter from India. So Iqbal was in England, and his son wrote him a letter asking him to bring back from England a gramophone, which was used to record and play music in those times. So it was something that was new, must have been expensive, like today's iPhones. Iqbal did not bring a gramophone back, but instead wrote a poem to him in which he reminded him what his son, what your priorities should be, and that you should not be enamored by the expensive contemporary fashions, of the West, but to focus on living a simple life which is connected to God, and which enables you to establish your own presence, your own position, your own reality in this world. So he wrote these famous verses for his son. Dayare ishq mein apna maqam paida kar, naya zamana naye subh sham paida kar, खुदा अगर दिले फितरत शनास दे तुझको, सकूते लालाओ गुल से कलाम पैदा कर, और मेरा तरीक अमीरी नहीं फकीरी है, मेरा तरीक अमीरी नहीं फकीरी है, खुदी ना बेच गरीबी में नाम पैदा कर. So I will not translate all of those verses, but essentially Iqbal is saying that try to create within your simple means an identity which is powerful, a narrative which is powerful, and don't be enamored by the expensive ways and fashions of the time. Iqbal's choice to use poetry as the vehicle for his message was a wise one, because today Iqbal's verses resonate throughout Pakistan, throughout the subcontinent. Even in Persia, he's famously known as Iqbal-e-Lahori. Today, in this meeting, in this session, we will cover many aspects of Iqbal's thinking, of Iqbal's messages, of Iqbal's poetry. We will have three important speeches, one on Iqbal's conception of Tawheed, one on Iqbal as a recipe for our spiritual crisis, and then a concluding address by the resident scholar, Dr. Suleiman Hassan, at the end. And all of these will be interspersed with poetic recitations, including by yours truly and some other colleagues who have come forward. So we look forward to your participation in this, your feedback on this. And without further ado, we will go to our first speech, which is on Iqbal's conception of Tawheed, which will then be followed by a rendition of Khudi ka sirr neha la ilaha illallah. The first speech on Iqbal's conception of Tawheed is by Dr. Adil Malik, who is a Globe Fellow at the University of Oxford. He works on the political economy of Muslim societies, and his work has been published in Financial Times, the New York Times, really a prolific scholar. And he also comes from a family which has dedicated its life to propagating and understanding the message of Iqbal. He's the son of Professor Fateh Muhammad Malik, who's arguably Pakistan's foremost scholar on Iqbal and Iqbaliyat. So, with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Adil Malik. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, friends. Um, it's a great pleasure to be with you today on the very kind invitation of my longtime friend and mentor, Muhammad Ali Abbas. We were together in Oxford and had a great opportunity to learn from each other, and I certainly learned a great deal about Iqbal from Ali. Um, when Ali invited me to talk about Muhammad Iqbal, I told him that I'm not an expert in Muhammad Iqbal. I am just a student and a scholar who works on political economy of the Muslim world. But like it is the case with many of the famous scriptures like Quran, Hadith, um, the works of great scholars, Rumi, Iqbal, Sadi, you discover these scriptures, these sacred texts, um, and the writings of great scholars like Muhammad Iqbal um, with time. So it's a process of discovery. And so what I'm going to do today is to share one such discovery about Muhammad Iqbal with all of the participants of this meeting. I've been writing a little piece on the moral economy of Islam. And in writing that piece, I was inspired by two people, Muhammad Iqbal and Dr. Ali Shariati, that great scholar of the Iranian Revolution, who also was a great admirer of Muhammad Iqbal. He admired Iqbal even more than Rumi and Hafiz and Sadi and a lot of other sort of great figures of Persia, um, precisely because he thought that whilst Rumi talked about love, Iqbal connected love with questions of power, with it, used love to think about a dynamic force that could change the reality of society. So what I am going to do today is to share with you a snippet from that chapter on moral economy of Islam that I have been writing. And one part of that article was to look at the concept of Tawheed. The oneness of God. That is, when we say we don't, God is la sharik, we consider God to be one, and we don't want to equate anybody else with Him. This is a foundational concept of Islam. It is also the most radical concept of Islam, in my opinion, but also the one that is most, uh, you know, misunderstood in a way, or least understood concept of Islam. Because when we grow up, we always think about, yes, what's the big deal about it? We do not consider anyone to be at par with God, and God is one. We believe in one God. We pray. In each prayer, we recite these, this emphasis. But I think actually there are layers and layers of meaning in the way we think about the oneness of God, or Tawheed, this idea um, that is largely revolving around Wahdaniyat, this sort of unity, unified domain. And Iqbal obviously um, it refers to this concept all the time. And he's someone who's not just interested in religious concepts for their own sake, but he is seeing these religious concepts as an important social input. So when he talks about batil dui pasand hai, haq la sharik hai, that the devil exists in duality, whereas haq la sharik hai, that God um, does not share his power with anybody else. Um, but I think in this concept, what's important to understand the idea of Tawheed in the context of the larger processes of social change. How can Tawheed, or a society that believes in Tawheed, can be radically different from the types of societies that human beings have witnessed over time, and the contemporary challenges that we face? The crucial point here is that when Iqbal says Haq la sharik hai, um, God's power is invisible, right? It's invisible. We cannot see God. What is visible? The visible is the powerful and the powerless. And God affiliates himself with the powerless. So if you are uh, actively believing in the oneness of God, you are not with the powerful, you are with the powerless, because God affiliates himself with the powerless. When God says, I'm sick, you didn't come to to see me. I need money, lend me the money. I was needy, you did not help me. What are we implying there? We're implying that God is associating himself with the most powerless people in society. So, an active idea of Tawheed is a radical and revolutionary concept because we believe in a higher moral order. We believe in a God that is not visible to us. What we can see is the powerful and the powerless. So then it is our responsibility to be with the powerless. And in a way, and struggle represented that struggle. It was targeted towards relieving human society of the oppression and injustice of the time. When we say haq la sharik hai, which means God does not, there's no participation in the power of God, but it's only by bringing people together through participation that you get the power of God. So in other words, God is one, but he's represented in multiplicity of people. So God can be seen through the prism of the many, through the prism of the society, through the prism of the larger collectivity. And I think in this context, um, divine power is a power where people are united. It's a holistic concept where everybody connects with everybody else. We are all interconnected in this world. As Bernie Sanders said, what is my religion? Well, my religion is that if there's somebody who's suffering in this room, I'm suffering. And then he said, we are in it together. Now that's the concept of the oneness of God in a way, because we are interconnected with each other. And through that unity, through that multiplicity, through recognizing that multiplicity, we recognize the power of God. Now, coming back to Iqbal, one key uh, sort of a piece of poetry that I often listen to, and you might have seen on the Virsa channel on YouTube, um, Khudi ka sirre neha, la ilaha illallah. I'm going to be referring to that particular poem as I speak. But one of the things that he's talking about is that he's talking about um, this whole idea of freedom and social responsibility, which lie at the center of the concept of Tawheed. Because when you submit yourself to God, you do not submit yourself to the other worldly gods that exist and that are visible, unlike God who's not visible to you, could be visible to the eye with your hard work. But all those gods that are visible to you, that's why Iqbal says, वो एक सजदा जिसे तू गिरा समझता है हजार सजदों से देता है आदमी को निजात. So once you submit yourself to a divine order, then you see the unity of being, then you see the world as an integrated space, then you see human beings as interconnected, then you go beyond the zero sum game where I'm benefiting, you are losing, or you are losing and I'm benefiting. No, that's not the framework of divinity. The framework of divinity is one where everything is interconnected. So this whole idea for freedom is extremely important in Iqbal's concept, and self and sovereignty. That's why he says "Khudi ka sirre niha la ilaha illa." Because you can really recover yourself through sovereignty, and true sovereignty comes when you believe in God, when you believe in a higher moral order, when you go beyond a zero sum game, and when you go beyond what he says, "Butane vehmo guma." These are all idols of the world. Ye malo daulate dunya, ye rishta o paivand, butane vehmo guma, la ilaha illallah. So a lot of what we suffer in this world, much of our suffering in this world, is because of undue attachment with this world. So when you believe in Tawheed, you are a traveler. You are a traveler in faith. You are on a journey and you are not overly attached to this world. That's when you truly regain your freedom. So all of these concepts I'm going to bring to light through some of the discussion that I'm going to share with you from my Moral Economy of Islam article. So I'm now going to read a little bit from that article and end my discussion on some contemporary introspections. As I mentioned to you, I'm thinking about Tawheed, this is sort of monotheistic claim of believing in one God, as a foundational belief. And as I said, this belief can have radical implications for the organization of society. Why? Because submission to the will of one God, who's the source of all power and sustenance, implies the denial of all worldly hierarchies that lack divine sanction. So, Tawheed is the input towards a non hierarchical society. A society built on Tawheed actively defies all worldly idols, whether they be power, wealth, class distinction, tribe, color, or race. The only hierarchy acceptable to God, and for which He alone is the final judge, we cannot judge that, is based on knowledge and piety. In its essence, therefore, Tawheed is revolutionary and non hierarchical, the foundation of building a just society. Tawheed is also an inclusive claim. Some Muslim scholars connect the sovereignty of God with the sovereignty of people, since God, the most powerful of all, has strong affinity with the weakest. And I just gave you some examples. In this view, monotheism implies universal inclusiveness because Tawheed gives power to society as a collective unit. It is extremely significant that the Quran starts in the name of God, Iqra bismi rabbik, and ends with the mention of people, An-Nas. And this is the idea that Dr. Ali Shariati, in his book on the sociology of Islam, was an eminent 20th century Muslim thinker. He distinguished Islam by its recognition that the masses as the basis, the fundamental and conscious factor in determining history and society. So he says Islam stands out because of its recognition uh, of masses, nas, as the fundamental and cautious factor in determining history and society. So, in this context, the Quranic expression of al-nas, which denotes mankind or the masses, carries special significance. The Islamic tradition elevates the poor and the downtrodden to a pedestal where support for them is symbolically equated with helping God. Lending money to the needy without expecting a return is therefore equivalent to lending to God. That's a big statement. And feeding the hungry is like feeding God. Now, what does this tell us? As I mentioned before, it tells us that you, when you are in the kingdom of God, when you believe in one God, you're actually believing in the power of the powerless. So, a society organized around the principle of Tawheed therefore imitates God's concern for the society's weakest. Therefore, through this conception of Tawheed, the universe is viewed as a harmonious, interconnected organism. Just as the divine order of creation cannot tolerate disharmony, so too a society based on Tawheed should have little room for stark economic and social disparities. A society reeling under the yoke of economic exploitation represents the vices of shirk, representing dualism and fragmentation. And we see a lot of this dualism and fragmentation around. Strictly defined, shirk represents polytheism, belief in many gods. In the social realm, it manifests as a subjugation of to worldly gods who appropriate the power that is exclusively reserved for God. The declaration of Pharaoh, whom we describe as Pharaoh in Urdu, the ancient monarch of Egypt, captures the spirit. And I now quote the Quran, verse 28. It says, I know of no God for you other than myself. So this is how the Quran describes Pharaoh as saying, I know of no God for you other than myself. And the Pharaoh's power was both unconditional and unconstrained, and their subjects acted in fear of them rather than in deference to a higher moral order that God has prescribed. The Quran therefore enjoins the believer to deny all such lords apart from God. And this is crucial to the idea of Tawheed. By supporting freedom and social responsibility, two essential elements for building a just society, monotheism can be an important political resource. It seeks to empower human beings by giving them dignity and agency, freeing them from the clutches of human tyranny. That's why Iqbal calls, Khudi ka sar le neha, la ilaha illallah. that's important for reclaiming self and sovereignty. The objective is to create a society that neither dominates others nor acquiesces to external subordination. And in my discussion with Ali, this was the crucial point, I think, because it's a disposition where you're truly sovereign. You don't want to dominate others, but neither do you want to be to agreeing to surrendering your own sovereignty and freedom to others. Even in the religious domain, Islam did not sanction the creation of an official or other intermediaries, although Muslim rulers eventually created such hierarchies. Tawheed is also connected with social responsibility. Islam urges believers to strive actively in establishing justice. The Quran proclaims, verily, God does not change the state of a people until they change the state of their own selves. So, every human being participates, both willingly or unwillingly, in the prevailing social order. The believer's responsibility is consciously to choose a path that leads to a merciful, compassionate, and just social order. Prophet Muhammad advised his companions to quote, help the oppressor and the oppressed. When prompted to clarify, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, explained that the oppressor could be helped by preventing him from oppressing others. And this, you could see how Imam Hussein and his struggle represented that. On another occasion, Muhammad questioned, how could God bless people who do not ensure the rights of the weak from the harsh? So, neutrality is not an option, and silence is a form of participation. Islam's struggle for social justice begins at the fundamental level of conscience that the idea of Tawheed inculcates in us. Like many other faith traditions, Islam enjoins believers to treat other human beings in the same manner they would like to be treated themselves. Believers are constantly warned against excessive accumulation and usurping the rights to others of the others. The idea of death as well as life as a stepping stone towards eternal life in the hereafter is a constant invitation to moderate consumption and accumulation and to extend care to society's downtrodden. These religious beliefs provide a form of internal control and a powerful psychological disposition against the most egregious forms of injustice and inequality. Now, what I'm going to do next is to end this discussion by actually talking about another extremely important concept that Mansur Hallaj, this famous saintly figure that operated in Baghdad and Basra, um, we always remember that he, is popularly remembered that he used the phrase "An al-Haq, I'm truth," and that's why he was put to gallows. The reality is more complicated. If you look at Mansur Hallaj's struggle, he was raised in the heart of growing revolt, and this revolt was taking place in Basra, and this revolt was taking place in the heart of one of the Middle East's only plantation economies. This was a plantation economy where the Muwallis, the slave laborers, and the Bedouin tribes were treated as slave labor. Their rights were denied, and there were big protests and rebellion. And this rebellion is often remembered as the Genj Revolution. Masood Hallaj was raised in the heart of that Genj Revolution. And over time, he came to represent a saintly disposition who opposed the ruler of the time and the morally decadent system that prevailed at the time. And he's believed to have advised his followers in the midst of a massive wheat crisis, wheat shortage that was entirely artificially produced because of the hoarding of these elite classes. He advised his believers to go and raid the houses and the granaries of the rich. Um, Now, that was obviously, this is the sort of disposition that would be extremely problematic from the perspective of the ruler. So, a lot of what we see the struggle within Islam um, uh, gives us very interesting insights in which, as an economist, I feel it's important to understand the political and the economic context that surrounds many of these events. And um, this was a discovery I made in the summer while working on this article um, on the Genj Revolution, Surah Laj, because you know from childhood days, one always hears about Mansour al-Hajj as al-Haq, but what's the surrounding political economy in which that clarion call was raised, we don't know much. Another discovery that I made in this process is that if you study the initial history of the rise of Islam, you will find that Makkah had an elite and many other elite groups represented by Quraysh and allied tribes. And ultimately, before the arrival of Islam, it was a competition for religious spoils. Because Makkah was a thriving trade center, pilgrims were coming in, they were competing, a lot of these elites were competing for the control over religious spoils. And reading through that, I realized that so many places in the world, from Lebanon to Iraq to Pakistan, you see so many religious elites who are effectively still selling those religious symbols. And I shuddered at the prospect of how, in the name of religiosity, we might be selling symbols of hatred rather than the symbols of love. That's a thought I just want to leave with you. But I want to end on a more positive note. And that positive note is again in this Khudi ka sirre neha, la ilaha illallah, in which Iqbal says, Ye daur apne barahim ki talash mein hai abhi. It's a beautiful uh, expression. ये दौर अपने बराहीम की तलाश में है अभी सनम कदा है जहां ला इलाहा इल्लल्लाह. Again, what does Ibrahim represent? He represents the healing touch of faith, the healing touch that Abraham represented, the healing touch of humanity. In today's world, which is divided, which is fragmented, where there's hatred, you remember these words even more, and you realize that we need new solidarities, including, as an economist, I feel, the economics of solidarity. We need to create solidarity within societies where wealth inequality is egregious, where the top segments of society are accumulated vast amounts of wealth, and have dispossessed so many people, pushing them onto the margins. That's the new economics of solidarity that is needed. And for that, we need to think about Ibrahim. ये दौर अपने इब्राहिम की तलाश में है अभी सनम कदा है जहां ला इलाहा इल्लल्लाह. But I want to end today's sharing with a beautiful quote from Saint Augustine. He was a famous, um, uh, Christian monk, a famous Christian saint, um, and he was raised at the time at which Roman Empire was at zenith, um, but actually on the brink of collapse. And a lot of his work um, is pointing towards a new form of citizenship that transcends worldly politics and creates an eternal city of God. Um, and in that book, Confessions, he talks about love, again, in exactly the same way as Ali Shariati or Iqbal talks about, or Rumi talks about, is the awakening of the soul for the weak and the downtrodden. And he said, well, what does love look like? Question mark. It has the hands to help others. It has the feet to hasten to the poor and the needy. It has eyes to see misery and want. It has the ears to hear the sighs and sorrows of men. This is what love looks like. So I'm back where I started. That God, when we believe in one God, we have to recognize that God is invisible. What is visible? The visible is the powerful, and the visible is the powerless. So the more is the powerless visible to your eyes, the more you can believe in the oneness of God, the more you can realize the social and economic and moral order of Tawheed in this world. Already taken a lot more time than I was allocated, and I'm extremely delighted to have shared my thoughts on this subject that I've been working rather reclusively on my own desk, but Ali gave me an opportunity to share these with you. I will be very happy to reconnect with your group again at some point. I think these are the sort of discussions of rediscovery of um, of Islam, rediscovery of ourself, rediscovery of our understanding of Iqbal is absolutely crucial for these times. Thank you very much.
खुदी का सिर निहाला इलाहा इल्लल्लाह ला اللہ لا الہ الا اللہ خودی ہے تیغ فساں لا الہ الا اللہ لا الہ الا اللہ یہ دور اپنے براہیم کی تلاش میں ہے یہ دور اپنے براہیم کی تلاش میں ہے صنم کدا ہے جہاں لا الہ الا اللہ لا الہ الا اللہ لا الہ الا اللہ لا الہ الا اللہ کیا ہے تو نے متاع غرور کا سودا کیا ہے تو نے متاع غرور کا سودا فریب سود و زیاں لا الہ الا اللہ لا الہ الا اللہ لا الہ الا اللہ لا الہ الا اللہ یہ مال و دولت دنیا یہ رشتہ و پیوند یہ مال و دولت دنیا یہ رشتہ و پیوند یہ مال و دولت دنیا یہ رشتہ و پیوند بتان وہم گمالا الہ الا اللہ لا الہ الا اللہ یہ نغمہ فصل گل و لالا کا نہیں پابند یہ نغمہ فصل گل و لالا کا نہیں پابند بہار ہو کے خزاں لا الہ الا اللہ لا الہ الا اللہ لا الہ الا اللہ لا الہ الا اللہ اگرچہ بت ہے جماعت کی آستینوں میں اگرچہ بت ہے جماعت کی آستینوں میں مجھے ہے حکم اذاں لا الہ الا اللہ لا الہ الا اللہ لا الہ illallah, la ilaha illallah.
Thank you, Dr. Adil. Thank you, Shuja. Firstly, for that excellent speech, Dr. Adil, where you set out Iqbal's conception of Tawheed, but also connected it to the broader social and political economic context in which many of these legends, not legends, real persons like Mansour al-Hallaj operated. This is really enlightening. Thank you, Shuja, for that beautiful recitation, which actually connected very nicely with Adil's speech. We will now progress the program. But before that, there was a question that was posted on the YouTube channel, and you're free to post them. It was about who was Iqbal's inspiration for his use of Shaheen or eagle as a metaphor or symbolism in his poetry. So the eagle has been a sort of an important symbol throughout time, going back to the Mesopotamian civilizations, through the Greeks, the Romans, in Europe. Many great powers have used the eagle as a symbol of success. I think in Iqbal's conception, though, the eagle is a bird that transcends the low level of existence or of material concerns that man is at, and really rises above. And in his mind, the eagle is a bird that also captures audacity to explore, audacity to think, to engage, including with the creator and develop a relationship with it. The eagle was a bird which was seen as one which could stare into the sun, one of the few birds. So I think both the idea that the eagle was sort of a bird of God or a higher level creature, and something which had audacity, was active and not passive, aligned very nicely with Iqbal's objective to lift the Muslims from their sort of lowly existence during the colonial period, and encourage them to rise above and soar and create a new reality. So that's probably the inspiration. I don't know whether there probably are common sources of inspiration for why the US also uses the eagle as an inspiration, but certainly Iqbal's angle was slightly different. We now have Dr. Sabi Anwar, the second keynote address, which is on Iqbal as a recipe for our spiritual crisis. Dr. Anwar is professor of physics and dean of the School of Science and Engineering at the Lahore University of Management Sciences in Pakistan. He is a Rhodes Scholar and secretary of the Khwarizmi Science Society, which is focused on the popularization of science at the grassroots level. In the last few years, he has lead organized several Lahore Science Melas, which have attracted hundreds of thousands of students from all over Pakistan. So over to you, Dr. Sabi Anwar.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. And Assalamu alaikum and good day to everyone. Today I would like to talk a little bit about Iqbal and the crisis of the modern world, which I think is of spiritual nature. On the one hand, we hear about climate change, which has uprooted the fine balance and equilibrium that has existed traditionally between the natural habitat and human existence. But now we all know that climate change has wreaked havoc on this fine equilibrium. And we now are fast approaching a state which goes beyond criticality. We also have the widening chasm between the haves and the have-nots in our human civilization. This increased economic deprivation leads to war, it leads to strife, it leads to friction between governments, it leads to national jingoism in many cases, and has made the world a more dangerous place to live in. However, something that goes unnoticed and is never registered on the agenda of our world organizations is the deep spiritual crisis that we have landed ourselves in. And this is the spiritual void, the emptiness, the vacuum that exists within us that leads to anger, to frustration, to anxiety, to a rat race behind materialism. And this is the question that Allama Iqbal tried to address about 100 years ago in the Indian subcontinent. And I would like to take recourse to some of his most beautiful poetry that talks about this spiritual crisis and the, the remedy that Iqbal proposes for his readership and for his listeners. Iqbal deeply speaks to this civilizational spiritual crisis. Uh, for example, when he says that, and I quote, दुनिया को है फिर मारिकाए रूहो बदन पेश दुनिया को है फिर मारिकाए रूहो बदन पेश तहजीब ने फिर अपने दरिंदों को उभारा. That this world once again is beset with this war between the spirit and the material, and civilization has let loose its most savage beasts. So in this verse, Allama Iqbal is really pointing towards a tussle between the spiritual and the material, between the lofty and the mundane, between the narrow and the straitened, and the expansive, between the transcendent and the cognizable. And the message that Iqbal wants to give to us is that while remaining in this material world, we can go beyond the apparent. We cannot let this material world sink unto us. Rather, we can rise above it, and we can make for ourselves goals and ambitions that take us beyond space time. In fact, we can create space time ourselves. And this creation of new possibilities, as Iqbal says, Maze takhliq maqasid zindaim, as shuai arzu tabindaim. This creation of new opportunities and possibilities is what keeps us alive and what makes us human. And this deepening crisis between the spiritual and the material has rather been accentuated by the onslaught of technology. And while science and technology have brought to us great fruits of luxury and amenity and facility and comfort, it has also brought in new challenges: the challenge of dataism, the challenge of artificial intelligence, the challenge of knowing it all, the superiority complex that comes with it has also deepened the scars that exist on our spiritual existence. And that is what Allama Iqbal, even though he predates the informational revolution, still the same message is applicable to the modern times. In fact, I would like to quote from a German philosopher, Eucken, when he writes, and this is in fact quite concordant with Iqbal's thoughts about the crisis that I'm mentioning. And I quote, "It seems as if man would never escape from himself. And yet, when shut into the monotony of his own sphere, he is overwhelmed by a sense of emptiness. The only remedy here is a radical transformation of the concept of man himself, and to distinguish with him the narrower and the larger life, the life that is finite and the life that is infinite and can never transcend itself." Unquote. So Iqbal has already pre-warned his readership not to be engrossed in the material world, but to be motivated to look beyond the apparent. The evident zamano makan, space time, may be the abode that we live in on a daily basis. It might be the habitat from where we derive nourishment, from where all our sustenance comes. But this is not the world that we navigate. The world that we navigate emerges from inside us, and it is the world that we create for ourselves. Therefore, humankind is an alter ego of the Al Khalik, who is the Ahsanul Khalikin. Man is a small Khalik in his own right, who creates his own world for himself. And this propensity to create brings about an experience which is not just a mystic experience, but it's truly a prophetic experience. And I'll talk about the difference between the prophetic and the mystic experience. So Iqbal talks to our spiritual self, but it does not address or tingle our monastic Sufism or tasawwuf or monastic mysticism or just like Neoplatonism or Illuminationism. Rather, it talks about a higher form of spirituality, which is pristinely prophetic in its essence. And there are different examples from Iqbal's poetry where he considers space time and the habitat that we live in to be important, but considers this environment, this physical environment, as a springboard to a world that goes beyond, as a catapult to Lamaka. For example, in the famous poem in Bangedara, Shama or Shair, the candle and the poet, Iqbal talks to us in the following manner. अपनी असलियत से हो आगा ए गाफिल के तू कतरा है लेकिन मिसाले बहरे बेपाया भी है क्यों गिरफ्तार तिलिस्म हीच मिकदारी है तू देख तो पोशीदा तुझ में शौकत तूफां भी है हिफ्त किश्वर जिससे हो तस्खीर बेते हो तफंग तू अगर समझे तो तेरे पास वो सामा भी है तू ही नादा चंद कलियों पर कनात कर गया वरना गुलशन में इलाज तंगी दामा भी है O the imprudent, beware of yourself. Discover yourself. Even though you may appear like a tiny droplet, there is in fact a boundless ocean harboring in your bosom. Why are you trapped and imprisoned in finitude? Even though you are a drop, but you still hold in yourself a storm that can become really big. And you can conquer the world without either a sword or a spear, because you have the arsenal to do so. And that arsenal really is called faqr or istighna or darveshi. And I pity you because you are content with just minor blossoms in the garden, even though there are flower beds, expanses of flower beds that can become the potion, the elixir of life for you. And this is also represented in another small poem called Kafiru Momin, in which Iqbal says, कल साहिल दरिया पे कहा मुझसे खिजर ने तू ढूंढ रहा है समय अफरंग का तिरयाक एक नुक्ता मेरे पास है शमशीर की मानिंद बरिंदा ओ सैकल ज़दा ओ रोशन ओ बर्राक काफिर की ये पहचान के आफाक में गुम है मोमिन की ये पहचान के गुम उसमें है आफाक. And I'll explain only the last couplet here. The non-believer is the one who is embroiled, engrossed, and drenched in the material world, whereas the believer is the one in whose heart lies the material world, who has imprisoned the material world unto oneself. So this is the key difference, that even though we are participants in space-time, Space time does not engulf us, rather, we engulf or we create space time. And this has a lot of consonance with the prophetic tradition, the hadith, that ad-dunya as-sijnu lil mu'min wal jannatu lil kafir, that this world is like a prison for a believer, and a, a beautiful garden for a non-believer. And one of the most beautiful verses that I like from Bala Jibril that talk about this spiritual emancipation, being a participant and being cognizant of the material world, yet remaining aloof from it, in a celebrated note of glory, is the following. अपनी जौलांगा जेरे आसमां समझा था मैं, आबो गिल के खेल को अपना जहां समझा था मैं, बेहिजाबी से तेरी टूटा निगाहों का तलिस्म, एक रिदाए नीलकूं को आसमां समझा था मैं, कारवां थक कर फजा के पेचो खम में रह गया, महरो माहो मुश्तरी को हम ही ना समझा था मैं, इश्क की एक जस्त ने तय कर दिया किस्सा तमाम, इस जमीनो आसमां को बेकरां समझा था मैं. Even though I had considered this world to be limitless, yet one leap of love, ishq ki just, helped me cover this entire expanse within the wink of an eye. So this is the power of the ego, which Iqbal calls khudi, which helps to elevate us from the daily grind of what the German philosopher says, the daily grind of everydayness, that helps us look beyond the daily, that helps us look beyond the everyday, and helps us conquer the elements that are around us. So this is the spiritual emancipation that Iqbal refers to. So Iqbal's monasticism or mysticism is not of the perennial kind, in which we submit to the Almighty. Rather, Iqbal's mysticism is of the prophetic kind, of the kind of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And Iqbal often cites the example of the ascension of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It is often called the Miraj, and believes that the Miraj gave the Prophet, peace be upon him, the strength and the fortitude to come back to the material world. So instead of the Prophet being absorbed into the reality, the ultimate reality, the Prophet decided to come back and participate in the cosmic action that happened in the 23 years of his life after prophethood. And Iqbal gives us the tonic, the prescription to achieve this prophetic, a semblance of this prophetic mysticism, and draws inspiration from the hadith that as-salatu mirajul mu'minin, that every moment, every believer can have the semblance of an experience of ascension through prayer. And when Iqbal talks about namaz or prayer, he not only talks about the formal ritual, he talks about namaz many times, as you know. एक ही सफ में खड़े हो गए महमूद अयाज, ना कोई बंदा रहा ना कोई बंदा नमाज. He also talks about the sajda, even though the sajda is a ritual in the prayer, yet the sajda has a special meaning in Iqbal's corpus of poetry. For example, he says, शौक तेरा अगर ना हो मेरी नमाज का इमाम, मेरा qiyam bhi hijab, mera sujood bhi hijab. Iqbal even talks of the azan, because the azan, in Iqbal's opinion, is a proclamation of the oneness of God, and is an announcement that a believer believes in disseminating the message of God, the message of oneness, the message of egalitarianism, and the message of freedom to all human races. वो सहर जिससे लरजता है शबिस्तान वजूद, होती है बंदाए मोमिन की अज़ां से पैदा. And Iqbal also talks about the informal mechanisms of prayer, in which one can incite the khudi, the self spiritual reawakening, and form a close connection with God Himself. And one of the mechanisms which Iqbal proposes is Ahe Sahargahi, the wails and the cries and the meditation one does in the early hours of the day. Sometimes he calls it Duae Neem Shabi. For example, he says, जब इश्क सिखाता है आदाब खुदागाही, खुलते हैं गुलामों पे असरार शहनशाही, अत्तार हो, रूमी हो, राजी हो, गजाली हो, कुछ हाथ आता नहीं वे आहे सहरगाही. So Iqbal's remedy to our spiritual emptiness, which has pervaded the modern civilization and which has arrested the growth and development of the human civilization, is through an inner spiritual reawakening. And this reawakening is of the prophetic kind, not of the mystic kind, not of the monastic kind, not of the kind alone of Rumi, not of the kind of Thomas Aquinas, not of the kind of Ibn Arabi. If you read the Javed Nama, you would find both Iqbal and Rumi being led in prayer by none other than a reformer of the modern world, Jamaluddin Afghani, and by a somewhat lesser known Turkish commander, Sayyid Halim Pasha. Imagine Rumi and Iqbal being disciples of Sayyid Halim Pasha or Jamaluddin Afghani. This is the kind of spiritual reawakening that incites one to action, to creation, to becoming conquerors of space-time. And I would just like to end by citing from the reconstruction of religious thought by Iqbal, and I quote, "Prayer as a means of spiritual illumination is a normal, vital act by which the little island of our personality suddenly discovers its situation in a larger whole life." Unquote. And thank you very much.
ये बता दीजिएगा. Thank you, Dr. Sabi, for that very illuminating lecture. I think the fact that we have ignored the spiritual vacuum and the spiritual crisis of the times is really a lament that many of us share with the modern age. And the way you have brought in Iqbal to connect us with how we can fill that gap and also connect us with the Holy Prophet and his ascension is really beautiful. Thank you very much. We will now transition to a recital of Iqbal's Shikwa Jawab-e Shikwa, which is arguably his most famous poem. I will recite an excerpt from it. Shikwa was a poem which translates as the complaint. So imagine yourself in the early 20th century. The British were in control. The Muslims had lost their prestige and influence in society, and they were really, second-grade citizens, third-grade citizens in society. And so Iqbal expresses a lament to God, and that's the complaint, shikwa. But then a few years later, he also wrote Jawab-e Shikwa, a response from God to that Muslim who was complaining. So the way this excerpt is recited is there are three verses first, three stanzas of Shikwa, then three stanzas of Jawab-e Shikwa, or God's response, then again three stanzas of Shikwa, then three stanzas of Jawab-e Shikwa, and then two stanzas in the end. So it'll take about 10 to 15 minutes, but hopefully it'll enable you to connect with the with this very thought-provoking and I would say emotional poem from Iqbal. So I'll go and recite it now. Bismillah. हमसे पहले था जब तेरे जहां का मंजर, कहीं मसजूद थे पत्थर, कहीं माबूद शजर, खूगरे पै कर महसूस थी इंसान की नजर, مانتا پھر کوئی اندیکھے خدا کو کیوں کر، تجھ کو معلوم ہے لیتا تھا کوئی نام تیرا، قوت بازوئے مسلم نے کیا کام تیرا، تھے ہم ہی ایک تیرے مار کا آراؤں میں، خشکیوں میں کبھی لڑتے کبھی دریاؤں میں، دی اذانے کبھی یورپ کے کلیساؤں میں، کبھی افریقہ کے تپتے ہوئے صحراؤں میں، شان آنکھوں میں نہ جچتی تھی جہاں داروں کی، کلمہ پڑھتے تھے ہم چھاؤں میں تلواروں کی، اور صفائے دہر سے باطل کو مٹایا ہم نے، نو انسان کو غلامی سے چھڑایا ہم نے، تیرے کعبے کو جبینوں سے بسایا ہم نے، تیرے قرآن کو سینوں سے لگایا ہم نے، پھر بھی ہم سے یہ گلا ہے کہ وفادار نہیں، ہم وفادار نہیں، تو بھی تو دلدار نہیں. And now it's the response from God. 3 stanzas. ہم تو مائل بکرم ہیں کوئی سائل ہی نہیں، راہ دکھلائیں کسے رہ رو منزل ہی نہیں، تربیت عام تو ہے جوہر قابل ہی نہیں، جس سے تعمیر ہو آدم کی یہ وہ گل ہی نہیں، کوئی قابل ہو تو ہم شان کئی دیتے ہیں، ڈھونڈنے والوں کو دنیا بھی نہیں دیتے ہیں، اور صفائے دہر سے باطل کو مٹایا کس نے، نو انسان کو غلامی سے چھڑایا کس نے، میرے کعبے کو جبینوں سے بسایا کس نے، میرے قرآن کو سینوں سے لگایا کس نے، تھے تو آبا وہ تمہارے ہی مگر تم کیا ہو، ہاتھ پر ہاتھ دھرے منتظر فردا ہو، اور ہر کوئی مست مئے ذوق تناسانی ہے، تم مسلمان ہو یہ انداز مسلمانی ہے، حیدری فقر ہے نہ دولت عثمانی ہے، تم کو اسلاف سے کیا نسبت روحانی ہے، وہ زمانے میں معزز تھے مسلمان ہو کر، اور تم خوار ہوئے تارک قرآن ہو کر. اور اب شکوہ کے 3 بند. عشق کی خیر وہ پہلی سی ادا بھی نہ سہی، جادہ پیمائی یہ تسلیم و رضا بھی نہ سہی، مضطرب دل صفت قبلہ نما بھی نہ سہی، اور پابندی آئین وفا بھی نہ سہی، کبھی ہم سے کبھی غیروں سے شناسائی ہے، بات کہنے کی نہیں تو بھی تو ہر جائی ہے، اور امتیں اور بھی ہیں ان میں گناہ گار بھی ہیں، عجز والے بھی ہیں مستے میں پندار بھی ہیں، ان میں کاہل بھی ہیں غافل بھی ہیں ہوشیار بھی ہیں، سینکڑوں ہیں کہ تیرے نام سے بیزار بھی ہیں، رحمتیں ہیں تیری اغیار کے کاشانوں پر، برق گرتی ہے تو بیچارے مسلمانوں پر، اور بنی اغیار کی اب چاہنے والی دنیا رہ گئی اپنے لیے ایک خیالی دنیا، ہم تو رخصت ہوئے اوروں نے سنبھالی دنیا، پھر نہ کہنا ہوئی توحید سے خالی دنیا، ہم تو جیتے ہیں کہ دنیا میں تیرا نام رہے، کہیں ممکن ہے کہ ساقی نہ رہے جام رہے۔ اور اب جواب شکوہ کے 3 بند، the response of God to the complaint۔ ہاتھ بے زور ہیں الہاد سے دل خوگر ہیں، امتی باعث رسوائی پیغمبر ہیں، بت شکن اٹھ گئے باقی جو رہے بت گر ہیں، تھا براہیم پدر اور پسر آزر ہیں، بادا شام نئے بعد نیا خون بھی نئے، حرم کعبہ نیا بت بھی نئے تم بھی نئے، اور کس قدر تم پہ گراں صبح کی بیداری ہے، ہم سے کب پیار ہے ہاں نیند تمہیں پیاری ہے، طب آزاد پہ قید رمضان بھاری ہے، تم ہی کہہ دو یہی انداز یہی آئین وفاداری ہے، قوم مذہب سے ہے مذہب جو نہیں تم بھی نہیں، جذبے باہم جو نہیں محفل انجم بھی نہیں، اور منفعت ایک ہے اس قوم کی نقصان بھی ایک ہی سب کا نبی دین بھی ایمان بھی ایک، حرم پاک بھی اللہ بھی قرآن بھی ایک، کچھ بڑی بات تھی ہوتے جو مسلمان بھی ایک، فرقہ بندی ہے کہیں اور کہیں ذات ہیں، کیا زمانے میں پنپنے کی یہی باتیں ہیں۔ And now the last 4 stanzas, 2 of complaint and 2 of response to complaint۔ قوم آوارہ انعطاب ہے پھر سوئے حجاز، لے اڑا بلبل بے پر کو مذاق پرواز، مضطرب باغ کے ہر غنچے میں ہے بوئے نیاز، تو ذرا چھیڑ تو دے تشنائے مضراب ہے ساز، نغمے بے تاب ہیں تاروں سے نکلنے کے لیے، تور مستر ہے اسی آگ میں جلنے کے لیے، اور چاک اس بلبل تنہا کی نوا سے دل ہوں، جاگنے والے اسی بانگ درا سے دل ہوں، یعنی پھر زندہ نئے اہل وفا سے دل ہوں، फिर उसी बाद आए देरी ना के प्यासे दिल हो अजमी कुम है तो क्या मैं तो हिजाजी है मेरे नगमा हिंदी है तो क्या ले तो हिजाजी है मेरी. And last two verses, response from God to the Muslim. तू ना मिट जाएगा ईरान के बिट जाने से नशाए मैं को ताल्लुक नहीं पैमाने से है आया यूरिश तातार के अफसाने से पासबा मिल गए काबे को सनम खाने से कश्तिये हक का जमाने में सहारा तू है असर नौरात है धुंधला सा सितारा तू है. And then last stanza. अक्ल है तेरी सिपर इश्क है शमशीर तेरी मेरे दरवेश खिलाफत है जहांगीर तेरी माँ से वल्लाह के लिए आग है तकबीर तेरी तू मुसलमान हो तो तकदीर है तदबीर तेरी कि मोहम्मद से वफा तूने तो हम तेरे हैं ये जहां चीज है क्या लौहो कलम तेरे हैं ये जहां चीज है क्या लौहो कलम तेरे हैं. So that was the recitation of Shikwa Jawabi Shikwa, which I hope you were able to connect with and jog some memories. What is important to note is that though Iqbal does express, this frustration that Muslims are second-rate citizens, and talks about the military and political dominance of the past, I think what is key is that he sees that the key element is spiritual strength, and he mentions that the Mongols, although they came as invaders, eventually became Muslim and became a part of the Muslim community. So we need to keep that spiritual tradition alive in us. So with that, we can now transition to the next presentation. We have among us Dr. Khusro Arastu, who is one of our resident psychiatrists, very respected member of our community, a prolific scholar of Islamic history and genealogies, which is his one of his pastimes. And he and his family, his father, have been deeply involved in Iqbaliyat and have studied Iqbal. And he wanted to share some ideas on how Iqbal transformed the ideas of key thinkers of his time and then represented them and even enhanced them for the consumption of his audience. So with that, Dr. Khusro, over to you.
Assalamu alaikum. So I'll try to share a screen here to share some slides.
Yes.
Okay. So, all right. So basically this presentation is about how Allama Iqbal transformed some of the ideas that were floating around during his time and his influence from the key thinkers of his time. So there are a few key concepts I just wanted to touch base with examples from his most popular and common poetry. Some of these include master morality and slave morality, and Shaheen as a symbol of Khudi and master morality in Iqbal's philosophy and poetry. and Übermensch from Nietzsche's philosophy of man and Superman concept to how he transformed to Mard-e Momin to Insan-e Kamil. And then the concept of will to power, the concept of self-love and universal love, or ishq. And then the nihilistic philosophies of the time, and which he transformed into the revival of the Islamic spirit. And then nationalism and eugenics that were floating around to the Islam call for Islamic unity. So he was influenced by many thinkers, some past and present. I just wanted to mention Jalaluddin Rumi and Ibn Arabi, particularly in Javed Nama, and also Dante's Divine Comedy, which has an influence in Javed Nama. Then his professor, Sir Thomas Arnold, and Nietzsche, and Henry Bergson. Henry Bergson wrote a book called Creative Evolution, which is kind of a rebuttal to the Darwinism. And then people like Heidegger, Ernst Haeckel, Immanuel Kant, and all. And some of these philosophers' ideas led to very dangerous things, and Allama Iqbal definitely foresaw some of these coming up. So this is a timeline of Allama Iqbal's works, and he was in Trinity College, Cambridge from 1905 to 1907, Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, Germany from 1907 to 1908. So this was a time where Europe was struggling and grappling with many, many isms like existentialism, Marxism, and later fascism. And so if you see the timeline of his poetry, first few works were pretty much Persian. Asrar-e-Khudi, Rumuz-e-Bekhudi, Payam-e-Mashraq, and Zubur-e-Ajam were all in Persian. And then Bhagya-Dara actually was first published in Urdu in 1924. And then all his later works, Bale Jibrail, Zarb Kalim, were in Urdu. Armaghan is Hijaz is partly in Urdu, partly in Persian, 50-50, and that was his last work before he passed away. So I will kind of go back to the first concept of master morality and slave morality, and Shaheen as a symbol of Khudi. So what Allama Iqbal conceptualizes Shaheen as a bird of power, and the idea of master morality and slave morality both as good concepts. One is you're meek, you're humble, you're good and hardworking also, but master morality, you're powerful, strong, and this went on well with the eugenics and the Germanic philosophers of the time. So nahi tera nasheman pasre sultani ki gumbat par, Shaheen hai tu basera kar pahadon ki chattanon par. So who dwells on the gumbats of Sultan? It's the pigeon. And so rather than be a pigeon, you have to be the Shaheen, you have to be the eagle. So, and not only that, in one aspect you have to be the master, in one aspect you have to be soft and meek and humble. Masaf-e zindagi mein sirat-e faulat paida kar. On the battlefield of life, become as sturdy as steel. Shabistan-e mohabbat mein harir-e parmiya ho ja. On the bedchamber of love, become soft as silk. So, and then in the same poetry, he also says, Guzar jaban ke sailotun durre ko bayan se, cut through the mountains and deserts like a raging river. Gulistan rah mein aaye to nagma jue nagma ko ho ja. So if a garden comes in the way, you become like a melodious stream. So this was his concept of transforming this master morality and slave morality to the concept of dual role of the Muslims, Sirat-e Faulat paida kar, and then all Hari Parmiya ho jaye, become sturdy as steel or soft as silk. Then the concept of self-ego in the Western philosophy to Khudi. Khudi hai sarre neha, Khudi hai tegh patam, you've heard that, la ilaha illallah. Ishq ek tegh hai, Khudi is tegh ki dhar. So if ishq is your sword, Khudi is the edge of the sword, that's what you fight with. And so in another poetry, he talks about Khudi mein doob ja ghafil, ye sirre zindagani hai, nikal ke halqa sham seher se javedan ho ja. Immerse yourself in your Khudi, O ghafil, or the forgetful one. This is the secret of life. Break out of the bounds of time and become eternal. Javedan ho ja. Then this concept of Übermensch, which was very prevalent, and this was a concept of man and Superman. This left to the eugenics, and also to some of the Nazi philosophies. This was like you are powerful, strong, intelligent, hardworking, and rulers. For Iqbal, it was becoming a Mard Momin. And from Mard Momin, you transform yourself to the Insani Kamil. How do you do that? It was basically very simple concepts from Iqbal. Yaqeen mehkam, amal pe hum, mohabbat fatah alam, jihad zindagani mein, ye hai momin ki shamsheer. So just, complete belief, pure actions, mohabbat fatah alam. This was the love of God. And jihad zindagani mein, these are the swords of the moment. ये जिहाद जिंदगानी में ये मर्दों की और मोमिन की शमशीर है. So, and to reach this level of insani kamil, he talks in other poetries about उरूज आदम खाकी से अंजुम सहमे हुए रहते हैं. कहीं ये खाक की चुटकी कहीं ये टूटा हुआ तारा मह कामिल न बन जाए. So it's very powerful. Okay, what is the scope of man? What this human can become. So another part of the शिकवा, जवाब शिकवा से खुशी al-Asr है, गर्दों पे गुजर रखती है, खाक की चुटकी है, रिफ़त पे नजर रखती है. So, and these are like the concept of how a Mard Momin can be transformed into the Insani Kamil. And the concept of will to power. This was also a big force of colonialism, and how Iqbal saw colonialism as the evil, and this was so prevalent. So it was a call to Muslims, खुदी को कर बुलंद इतना कि हर तकदीर से पहले खुदा बंदे से खुद पूछे बता तेरी रजा क्या है. So this is how you will to power. It becomes such that Allah is giving you permission, or your bata teri raza kya hai, what do you want? And then in कि मोहम्मद से वफा तूने तो हम तेरे हैं, ये जहाँ चीज है क्या लौह कलम तेरे हैं. So if you are faithful to the message of Prophet Muhammad, तो हम तेरे, and the लौह कलम is लौह महफूज. This is the tablet का जिक्र है, where you can write your own destiny. ये जहाँ चीज है क्या लौह कलम तेरे हैं. So the last part, not the last part, the self-love or the very egotistic concepts and philosophies of the West, Allama transformed it into a concept of universal love. इश्क एक सैल है, सैल को लेता है थाम. इश्क एक सिल है, सिल का चीर लेता है दिल. इश्क मकानो मकीन, इश्क ज़मानो ज़मीन. इश्क सरापा यकीन और इश्क फतेह यान. इश्क इंतहा अजब, इश्क इब्तिदा अदब. इश्क के मिज़राब से नगमा तारे हयात. इश्क नूर हयात, इश्क नारे हयात. So what is this इश्क? इश्क of God. इश्क दमे जिब्राइल, इश्क दिल मुस्तफ़ा. इश्क खुदा का रसूल, इश्क खुदा का कलाम. इश्क सरमाया महराब व मिंबर. इश्क मौला अली खैबर शिकन. इश्क सदक इश्क भी है, खलील भी है इश्क. सब्र हुसैन भी है इश्क. मारकाए वजूद में बद्र हुनैन भी है इश्क. इश्क अदल हसन, इश्क इबादत ज़ैन. So this concept, how even Allama Iqbal transcends the concept of ishq from the universal ishq to Khuda and to the Ahlul Bayt also here, So Allama Iqbal was seeing all these isms growing in the West, and how Islamic world is kind of completely in humiliating subservience to the colonial powers, So, and then like Ali Abbas Bhai recited, थे तो आबा वो तुम्हारे भी मगर तुम क्या हो, हाथ पर हाथ धरे मुंतजर फरदा हो. So this was a call for action for the Muslim. हो लाख ज़मीं देख, फलक देख, फजा देख, मशरिक़ के उभरते हुए सूरज को जरा देख. उठो मेरी दुनिया के गरीबों को जगा दो, खाको मराओ दर दीवार हिला दो. जिस खेत से देखा को मुयस्सर नहीं रोजी, उस खेत के हर होश गंदम को जला दो. So this was like trying to inject action into the Muslim world. So, and then where is Muslims right now? Tu abhi rah guzar mein hai, qaid maqam se guzar, Misr o Hijaz se guzar, Faris o Sham se guzar. Karche hai dil kusha bahat, husne faram ki bahar. Na tayar buland o bal, dana o dam se guzar. You know, revolution in its power is the beauty of the West. Take your flight, you know, don't fall for this earthly trap. जिसका अमल है बेगरज उसकी जजा कुछ और है खूरो ख़याम से गुजर बादा उजाम से गुजर you know all these are calls to action, you know, how you know we are just being callous and हाथ पर हाथ रखे तज़रे फरदा बैठे हैं ये रस्म अज़ां रह गई रूह बिलाली ना रही फलसफा रह गया मगर तलकीन गजाली ना रही. So, you know, who is the Muslim? You know, where is he coming from? You know, तू राज कुन फका है अपनी आंखों पर आया हो जा खुदी का राजदां हो जा खुदा का तर्जुमा हो जा. You know, this is such a powerful verse. You know, you are the secret of creation. Kun fayakun say this, and reflect yourself in your own eyes. अपनी आंखों पर आया हो जा खुदी का राजदां हो जा and खुदा का तर्जुमा हो जा. You become the secret of yourself and become a spokesperson for God, you know. So, अभी सितारों के आगे जहां और भी है, अभी तेरे इम्तिहान और भी है. So this revivalist spirit continues in so many of his poetry, you know. But you know, where are you? Well, how do you come back into action? You know, yeah, and his prayer, you know, Ya Rab dil Muslim ko zinda tamanna de, जो खल्ब को गरमा दे, जो रूह को तड़पा दे. फिर वादी फारा में हर जर्रे को चमका दे फिर शौक तमाशा दे फिर ज़ौक़ तकाज़ा दे. You know, so दयार इश्क में अपना मकाम पैदा कर नया ज़माना नए सुबह शाम पैदा कर. So and this is again some of our friends have recited and I just wanted to reiterate that, you know. So from nationalism and eugenics concepts which led to so many terrible regimes in Europe, like the fascism in Spain and Mussolini in Italy and the Hitler, you know. So a call for the Muslim unity, you know. So this is like हवस ने टुकड़े टुकड़े कर दिया है नौ इंसान को उखुवत का बयां हो जा मोहब्बत की जुबान हो जा. Greed has fragmented the humanity into pieces, and not just humanity, Muslim ummah. So, ukhuwat ka bayan ho ja, mohabbat ki zuban ho ja. Be a statement of brotherhood and be a language of love. तू हिंदी है वो ये हिंदी है वो खुरासानी ये तू रानी वो अफगानी तू शर्मिंदा साहिल उछल कर बेगिरा हो जा. So just, you know, you are all these sectarian ethnic things, you know, you are a sahil, you know, just uchal kar begiran ho ja. You are a banks of an ocean or a river, you know, just come out of that, you know. So and again, यूं तो सैयद भी हो मिर्जा भी हो अफगान भी हो बताओ क्या मुसलमान भी हो. फिरकाबंदी है जमाने में और कई जाते हैं के जमाने में पनपने की यही बात है. एक ही सबका रसूल दीन भी ईमान भी है हरम पाक भी है कुरान भी है अल्लाह भी है कुछ बड़ी बात की होते जो मुसलमान भी है. Thank you.
Thank you, Khusro Bhai. Thank you for that wonderful rendition of ideas and poetry. Mashallah, you are an encyclopedia of Iqbal's verses. Thank you so much. I think I will have to re-listen to this and look at all the different verses that you've recited and how well you've connected them. We will press on with the rest of the program. And we have two recitals. One on Imam Hussein alayhi salam and one on his mother, Lady Fatima salamullah alayha. But I think to put this into context, we got a question on YouTube whether Iqbal had converted to Shia Islam toward the end of his lifetime. And I think it's a tribute to Iqbal's universal message that all sects of Islam want to, see him as a member of them. But Iqbal this was a conscious effort on Iqbal's part, I think also to take the best from all traditions and make them a genuine and sincere part of his own person and his teachings. For example, even the concept of Imam Mahdi, where Sunni and Shi'i conceptions differ, he famously said, "Khizre waqt az khalwate dashte hijaz ayat berun, karvan zin wadiye duro daraz ayat berun." And some scholars like Dr. Israr Ahmad have noted that in this verse, which is about Mahdi being in Khalwat, Iqbal has made a deliberate effort to incorporate both the Shi'i and Sunni conceptions of Imam Mahdi. Khalwat can refer to Ghaiba, which is the Shia belief that the Imam is in occultation, or just to being unrecognized, which is perhaps more consistent with the Sunni conception that he still has to be born and raised. So I think that said, Iqbal certainly did have a special relationship with the Ahlul Bayt of the Holy Prophet, and he famously said, "Puchte kya ho mazhab-e Iqbal, ye gunahgar bu turabi hai." And I think the tributes that he has paid to Imam Hussein and Lady Fatima and Imam Ali in his poetry certainly show a special veneration for the household of the Prophet, peace be upon them. So, consistent with that, a couple of renditions, and then we will progress to the closing speech by Dr. Suleiman Hassan. So, let me start with the rendition on Imam Hussein. Hang on, let me just play that. Okay, I hope you can see it. And this is taken from his Persian kalam, Asrar Rumuz, and the translation is adapted from R.A. Nicholson's translation. It's on freedom in Islam and the secrets of Karbala. آن امام عاشقان پور بتول سرو آزاده ز بستان رسول الله الله بای بسم الله پدر مانی ذبح عظیم آمد به سر وندگر مالای ابرار جهان قوت بازوی احرار جهان در نوای زندگی سوز از حسین اهل حق حریت آموز از حسین موسی و فرعون و شبیر و یزید این دو قوت از حیات آید پدید زنده حق از قوت شبیری است باطل آخر داغ حسرت میری است چون خلافت رشته از قرآن گسیخت حریت را زهر اندر کام ریخت بر زمین کربلا بارید و رفت لاله در ویرانه ها کارید و رفت مدعایش سلطنت بودی اگر خود نکردی با چنین سامان سفر دشمنان چون ریگ صحرا لا تعد دوستان او به یزدان هم عدد تیغ بهره عزت دین است و بس مقصد او حفظ آیین است و بس ما سوی الله را مسلمان بنده نیست پیش فرعونی سرش افکنده نیست. خون او تفسیر این اسرار کرد، ملت خوابیده را بیدار کرد. نقش الا الله بر صحرا نوشت، سطر عنوان نجات ما نوشت. شوکت شام و فر بغداد رفت، ستوت قرنات هم از یاد رفت. تار ما از زخمش لرزان هنوز، تازه از تکبیر او ایمان هنوز. ای صبا ای پیک دور افتادگان، اشک ما بر خاک پاک او رسان. ای صبا ای پیک دور افتادگان، اشک ما بر خاک پاک او رسان. اشک ما بر خاک پاک او رسان. So this is the tribute that Iqbal pays to Imam Hussein on his great sacrifice in Karbala. And I have with us Dr. Jawad Hasnain, who is a passionate reciter of Iqbal's poetry, especially his Persian poetry. And one of the kalams of Iqbal that I've heard him recite with great sincerity, great clarity, is his tribute to the mother of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, Lady Fatima Zahra salamullah alayha. So I will ask Brother Jawad Hasnain to now present his recitation. Dr. Jawad is a resident medical professional. He's a doctor, and he's been part of our literary gatherings for decades. So Dr. Jawad, over to you, and I will ask Brother Khurram to relay the presentation as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ali Abbas. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to recite this unique poem Allama Iqbal wrote on Hazrat Fatima Zahra Salamullah Alaiha. I have read a lot of Urdu and Farsi poetry on Hazrat Fatima Salamullah Alaiha, and also have been privy through my dad Abajan to on the Arabic literature. But this is a unique poetry, poetic tribute to Hazrat Fatima Zahra Salamullah Alaiha, whom Allama Iqbal says that she is the perfect role model for the ladies of Islam. So I'm going to start now. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maryam az yak nisbate Isa aziz, Maryam az yak nisbate Isa aziz, as-se nisbat Hazrat Zahra aziz, as-se nisbat Hazrat Zahra aziz, Noor chashme rahmatan lil alameen, آن امام اولین و آخرین، آن که جان در پیکر گیتی دمید، روزگار تازه آیین آفرید، بانو آن تاجدار حل عطا، بانو آن تاجدار حل عطا، مرتضی مشکل کشا شیر خدا، پادشاه و قلبه ایوان او، پادشاه و قلبه ایوان او، یک حسام و یک زرا سامان او، مادر آن مرکز پرکار عشق، مادر آن مرکز پرکار عشق، مادر آن قافله سالار عشق، آیک شمع شبستان حرم حافظ جمعیت خیر الامم تا نشیند آتش پیکار و کین پشت پا زد بر سر تاج نگین تا نشیند آتش پیکار و کین پشت پا زد بر سر تاج و نگین و دگر مولای احرار جهان قوت بازو احرار جهان در نوای زندگی سوز از حسین اهل حق حریت آموز از حسین سیرت فرزنده ها از امهات سیرت فرزنده ها از امهات جوهر صدق و صفا از امهات مزرعه تسلیم را حاصل بتول مزرعه تسلیم را حاصل بتول مادران را اسوه کامل بتول بهر محتاج دلش آگونه سوخت بهر محتاج دلش آگونه سوخت با یهود چادر خود را فروخت نوریو هم آتشین فرما برش نوریو هم آتشین فرما برش گم رضاوش در رضایی شاهرش ادب پرورده صبر و رضا ادب پرورده صبر و رضا آسیا گردد و لب قرآن سرا گریه های او ز بالی بی نیاز گاه افشاندی به دامان نماز اشک او پرچید جبریل امین اشک او پرچید جبریل امین همچو شبنم ریخت بر عرش برین رشته آیین حق زنجیر باز رشته آیین حق زنجیر باز فرمان جناب مصطفی رشته آیین حق زنجیر باز فرمان محمد مصطفی ورنه گرده تربتش گردیدمه ورنه گرده تربتش گردیدمه سجده ها بر خاک او باشیدمه. شکریہ.
Thank you, Dr. Jawad Hasnan. As usual, that was a beautiful, clear recitation. And I think when we listen to it with the slides, it will reinforce our understanding of Iqbal's tribute to Lady Fatima, a fitting tribute indeed. So we have our closing speech from Dr. Maulana Suleiman Hassan. Maulana Suleiman Hassan is the resident scholar at Shahe Najaf Islamic Center here in Washington, D.C., which is the host for this program. He specialized in Islamic jurisprudence and history in Qom in Iran and returned to the United States in 2007. He has served as religious director at the Baitul Ilm Academy in Chicago. And Dr. Hassan, in addition to his religious training, also holds a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from the University of Chicago. So we're very fortunate to have him summarize or provide concluding remarks to this program. Following that, there will be one final recital, and then we will end the program. Over to you, Dr. Suleiman. Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you, Dr. Ali Abbas, and to all of our presenters and reciters. This program exceeded my expectations and hopes, and I hope that all of our participants and attendees feel likewise. The reason for holding this program is because it's often an ignored part of our identity and our spiritual and religious development, that religion is not just a matter of learning what the teachings of our faith are or the practices, the rituals that we perform, but it is the complete package of our life, our art, our civilization, our literature, our thoughts, our dreams, our practice. All of this is part of our spiritual development. And so it's very important for us as Muslims to strengthen our intellectual conception with our faith, our practice of the teachings, the commandments of our faith, but also our connection with the cultural and the aesthetic elements, the artistic elements, the civilizational elements of our faith. And that's why great literature and great thinkers and great poetry in the Islamic tradition should never be seen as the exclusive preserve or legacy of a subgroup within Islam. We don't have Arabic and Persian and Turkish and Urdu and other poetry, but all of those are part of that great tapestry of the Islamic tradition. And to connect with that poetry, benefit from it, and be inspired by it is both something that can help us preserve our religiosity, but also it can be an inspiration for us to create poetry and art that represents the values and the ideals of Islam in our time and in our languages. And that is one of the hopes we have from this event and other events like it, that members of our community who are fluent in English, who have a talent and an interest in art, they can be inspired to translate the timeless and the beautiful teachings of Islam and the insights of Islamic civilization into a language and a medium that will be of greatest benefit to our society. I want to just say a few words, and I will keep my remarks very brief because we have had some very beautiful renditions of Iqbal's poetry with eloquent translations in English and insightful talks about different aspects of the thought of Muhammad Iqbal. But I want to say a few words about some of the things that make the thought of Iqbal in particular relevant to our own times. And if we look at the current political and social civilization situation in the world, what we'll find is that nationalism and the harmful effects of an extreme individualism are being felt in this country and in many other places throughout the world. There was a time when Muslims were often united by the anti-colonial and by the uplifting economic, social, and political inspiration we get from Islam. And in today's time, there are many voices that want to separate that single ummah, that community and nation of followers of Prophet Muhammad, into different groups, whether those groups are based on ethnicity, on the concept of a nation state, or whatever other boundaries there may be. And this is a challenge that is not new, but it's something that every generation has to address. And it's something that Iqbal has very beautifully expressed by tying the unity of the Muslim Ummah to Tawheed. And this is part of Jawab al-Shikwa, which Dr. Ali Abbas recited a selection from. Among the verses of this poem, Iqbal says, Jo Musalman tha Allah ka saudai tha. At one time, Muslims were concerned with Allah. That is the primary intellectual and spiritual concern that Muslims had. They weren't thinking about their individual identity and their ethnic or their linguistic identity as something that separates them or that is a point of pride. And then in that form of critiquing nationalism and the separation from the divine, the next verse continues, Kabhi mahboob tumhara yahi har jai tha. the same universal God was once the beloved of the Muslims. Speaking in the voice of God, figuratively, Iqbal says, so go ahead and become the servant of a regional, a national, an individual God. Serve yourself, meaning your material self. Millat Ahmad mursal ko maqami kar lo. And then you will take that beautiful universality of the Islamic teaching and you will make it something that is limited and that loses its unifying and its spiritual aspect. So this is one of the things that we learn from Allama Iqbal, and it's something that distinguishes the thought of Iqbal. Many Islamic thinkers, Allama Tabatabai in Tafsir al-Mizan, they have described three different ways that we can learn about truth. One is through the intellect. One is through divine revelation or wahi. And one is through spiritual practice and purification, where truth and insight then becomes clear to us in our heart and in our soul in a spiritual manner. For most of us, however, revelation means that we read the Quran, we read the sayings of Prophet Muhammad and Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, and we try to understand them to the best of our ability. The intellectual aspect means that we read the works of scholars, of theologians, of philosophers, and then we try to digest and understand what we learn. And for the spiritual path, many of us, what we can do is we can simply try to understand the message that comes to us from people who have traveled the spiritual path and purified their own souls to a level that maybe you and I have not yet done. And this is one of those areas where the importance of poetry is so clear, because it allows us to relate to things not just through our experience and not just through our intellect, but through a direct connection with our emotions and with our soul. And therefore, it allows us to transcend the limits of our own intellect and even the limits of our own spiritual purification, to be able to conceive of a horizon that goes far beyond our own. And that's something that we can see as a little bit of a tension within the thought of Iqbal, because he was dealing not just with the individual Muslim, but with the totality of Islamic civilization and the Ummah. When you have a broad horizon, when you're dealing with something as vast as an entire Ummah, then of course there are going to be different, seemingly contradictory needs and messages within that vast unit. And within the development of the spiritual and religious and social life of the Ummah, Iqbal tries to bring out those aspects that lead to the advancement and the success of and the upliftment of that entire community. So the first thing that we have to remember is that Iqbal is not just a poet for individual spirituality, but he is a poet who wants to speak to the entire Muslim community, the entire nation. And he says that in one of his verses, Fard qaim rab de millat se hai, tanha kuch nahi. The individual is only going to be able to stand up and reach his or her full potential through their connection to the millat, through their connection to the ummat. Mauj hai darya mein aur birun darya kuch nahi. A wave is only a wave if it's part of the ocean. And when you separate the water from the ocean, then the wave loses its potency, its beauty, and its power. So that individualism destroys the wave. It doesn't strengthen it, doesn't beautify it. And that universality, which comes from the spiritual message of Islam, from the belief in the oneness of God, that is a unique characteristic of the Muslim nation. Iqbal says, "Apni millat ko qiyas aqwam maghrib pe na kar, khas hai tarkib mein qawm Rasul Hashimi." Don't compare your community with a nation or a nation state. The people of Prophet Muhammad, they have a unique constitution, which is a desire to serve and worship God in all aspects of their life. So this is something that gives us an understanding of why there is a tension and sometimes a seeming contradiction in some of the poems that we might find from Allama Iqbal, because he's dealing with the vastness of Islamic civilization and immersing his reader or his audience in the history and then in the spirit that animates that civilization. And I think we can go one step farther than saying that he wanted to unify just Muslims beyond the barriers of race and ethnicity and geography. But in reality, he wanted Muslims to live up to the message and the duty given to them by God, so they can be an example for all of humanity and help even non-Muslims transcend this material existence to live in this world without being of this world. That is a message that I think came out very beautifully in some of the talks and renditions that we have today, and I hope that it has inspired all of us to reconnect with some of the sources of Islamic literature, and in particular with Allama Iqbal, and to benefit from the horizons of thought that they open for each and every one of us. Thank you to all who helped put this program together, and in particular, Dr. Ali Abbas and your family, Sister Wafa, and all of those who contributed an excellent job. May Allah reward you. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Dr. Suleiman Hassan, for that very nice closing, which brings out the complexity of circumstances that Iqbal faced, and then how we should approach some of his poetry. I think this is very important. I think I will link to that, to the final recitation, which will close the program, which is that whenever you have a thinker who is very influential, like Iqbal, who is also active in the political space, there is a tendency to simplify or oversimplify his message to push a certain agenda. But Iqbal knew about this risk, and in some sense, some of his poetry explicitly pushes back against this tendency to compartmentalize him and to enable him to be seen as part of a broader movement which appeals to not just a particular generation of Muslims in a particular setting, but also not just to Muslims, but to the broader, humanity that can find a connection with his message. So I think the most interesting recital we have saved for the last, it will be by Zulekha Hussain. But before that, I just want to thank everyone again who has contributed to this program. The speakers, Dr. Adil Malik, Dr. Sabi Anwar, Dr. Suleiman Hassan, the reciters, Shuja Hussain, Dr. Jawad Hasnain, Dr. Khusro Arastu for his very interesting combination of poetry and ideas. And I also want to thank Dr. Khurram Raza, Mr. Khurram Raza, who has been controlling this program and in these virtual times has brought it and executed an exemplary delivery. So thank you, everyone. Inshallah, we will follow up with a subsequent program, perhaps on Josh Miri Abadi or some other poet, but in due time. This program will be recorded, is being recorded, and will be available for viewing on the Shahe Najaf YouTube link. So if you type Iqbal and Shahe Najaf, hopefully it will pop up on YouTube. Thank you, everyone. I just want to end with this prayer from my side of Iqbal. Dilon ko markaze mehro wafa kar, harime kibriya se aashna kar, jise nane javi bakhshi hai tune, use bazu-e Haidar bhi ata kar. And in this, Iqbal is basically saying that Muslims are, I think he's commenting on the poverty, material poverty of the Muslims of the time, or the material, the relative lack of influence that the Muslims have. But he's then saying that there was one man who also ate very little, Nane Javeen, Imam Ali, but he had the strength in his arm, which was more powerful than empires. And so he prays to God to give the Muslims, despite their paucity of means, that strength that Imam Ali had, Imam Ali Khaybar Shikan. So with that prayer, let's end this program. But the final recital, the final most interesting one from Zulaikha Hussain. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
And I would like to thank the organizers for including me in this program. मेरी ये खुशकिस्मती है कि मैं हैदराबाद दक्कन से आपसे मुखातिब हूँ. Hyderabad is a bastion of Urdu. There are many organizations devoted to Iqbal, such as Allama Iqbal Academy, Aiwan-e-Urdu, and many libraries that are really hold Urdu literature dear to their heart. One of them is this library that I'm here in today. And I would love to end the program today. Such beautiful sentiments we've heard about Allama Iqbal. We've understood so much of his words, his teachings. I'd like to end by giving Allama himself the last word. This is one of his poems in which, one of his few poems in which he has himself described his own religious teachings, his leanings, his divergent ideas. And we wanted to conclude the program with Zuhud and Rindi. Zuhud means piety, Rindi is libertinism, and it's a hypothetical conversation that Allama Iqbal is having with his neighbor, who has cast some doubts, some questioning his religious tendencies, his ideas, and Iqbal is trying to explain to him what his thoughts are, where he's coming from, and then towards the end you'll see that he says, even Allama Iqbal himself says, I can't understand myself. There are so many more things for me to grasp about my own identity. So I'll go ahead. एक मौलवी साहब की सुनाता हूँ कहानी, तेजी नहीं मंजूर तबीयत की दिखानी. लबरेज मैं ज़ुहद से थी दिल की सुराही, थी तह में कहीं दुर्द ख्याले हमदानी. करते थे बयां आप करामात का अपनी, मंजूर थी तेदाद मुरीदों की बढ़ानी. मुद्दत से रहा करते थे हम साये में मेरे, थी रिंद से जाहिद की मुलाकात पुरानी. हजरत ने मेरे एक शनासा से ये पूछा, इकबाल के है कुमरी शमशाद मानी. पाबंदी अहकाम शरीयत में है कैसा, गोशेर में है रश्के कलीमे हमदानी. सुनता हूं कि काफिर नहीं हिंदू को समझता, है ऐसा अकीदा असर फलसफादानी. है उसकी तबीयत में तशय्यु भी जरा सा, तफजील अली हमने सुनी उसकी जुबानी. कुछ आर उसे हुस्न फरोशों से नहीं है, आदत ये हमारे शोरा की है पुरानी. गाना जो है शब को तो सहर को है तिलावत, इस रम्ज के अब तक न खुले हम पे मानी. मजमुए अजदाद है इकबाल नहीं है, दिल दफ्तरे हिकमत है तबीयत खफकानी. उस शख्स की हम पर तो हकीकत नहीं खुलती, उस शख्स की हम पर तो हकीकत नहीं खुलती, होगा ये किसी और ही इस्लाम का बानी. इस शहर में जो बात हो उड़ जाती है सब में, मैंने भी सुनी अपने अहब्बा की जुबानी. एक दिन जो सरे राह मिले हजरत जाहिद, फिर छिड़ गई बातों में वही बात पुरानी. फरमाया शिकायत वो मोहब्बत के सबब थी, था फर्ज मेरा राह शरीयत की दिखानी. मैंने ये कहा कोई गिला मुझको नहीं है, ये आपका हक था ज़हर कुर्ब मकानी. गर आपको मालूम नहीं मेरी हकीकत, پیدا نہیں کچھ اس سے قصور ہمدانی. میں خود بھی نہیں اپنی حقیقت کا شناسا، گہرا ہے میرے بحر تخیل، گہرا ہے میرے بحر خیالات کا پانی. مجھ کو بھی تمنا ہے کہ اقبال کو دیکھوں، کہ اس کی جدائی میں بہت اشک فشانی. اقبال بھی اقبال سے آگاہ نہیں ہے، اقبال بھی اقبال سے آگاہ نہیں ہے. کچھ اس میں تمسخر نہیں واللہ نہیں ہے. شکریہ.
دیار عشق میں اپنا مقام پیدا کر، نیا زمانہ نئے صبح و شام پیدا کر. خدا اگر دل فطرت شناس دے تجھ کو، سکوت لالا و گل سے کلام پیدا کر. میرا طریق امیری نہیں فقیری ہے، خودی نہ بیچ غریبی میں نام پیدا کر. مخالف سے نہ گھبرا اے عقاب، یہ تو چلتی ہے تجھے اونچا اڑانے کے لیے. سر سے ڈراتا ہے اسے تو بیکار، ہو چکا ہے جو نسیم سحری سے 100 بار. نہیں تیرا نشیمن قصر سلطانی کے گنبد پر، تو شاہی ہے بسیرا کر پہاڑوں کی چٹانوں میں. تجھے کسی طوفان سے آشنا کر دے کہ تیرے بحر کی موجوں میں اضطراب نہیں. تجھے کتاب سے ممکن نہیں فراغ کہ تو کتاب خواہ ہے صاحب کتاب نہیں. خودی کو کر بلند اتنا